that, welcome to today's presentation. My name is Graham McCarty. I'm a local foods and small farms extension educator that works in Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. I know that some folks are from our area, as well as I know there's a couple of folks from other parts of the state that are joining us today, and very welcome to have you all here with us on a topic that has seemed to change over the last couple of weeks. As I was putting together today's presentation, I was thinking that there were going to be some topics that we really couldn't talk about anymore. And yet the weather has really changed this last week and looks to be a little bit warmer this upcoming week, that there are some tasks that we will be able to really be able to cover in today's presentation, which is pretty exciting. A little about me, I work a lot with fruit and vegetable growers that sell directly to consumers. So farmers markets, pick your own operations, as well as those that have apple orchards in our area, and provide a lot with production, disease and insect management, and so forth. I also do a lot of work with homeowners, and that's where kind of a lot of my work tends to be, is helping homeowners that are growing fruits and vegetables in the backyard or looking to scale up, and provide them with courses, resources, and try to answer some of those questions that you might have. Some of the photos you're going to see today are from my home. I recently purchased a home in the last year, and so I've been growing a lot of different things in my backyard this season and run into issues, of course, as we all do, but also have some pretty good successes. So I'll share a lot of these photos with you today. One thing to also mention is that, this hour presentation crams in a lot, and yet many of these topics we're going to talk about could be their own 1 hour, 2 hour presentation. So at the end of today, this afternoon, I will send you an email with a lot of resources for kind of additional information. We'll talk about making compost, and that would be covered, say, in 2 to 3 minutes. And yet you could spend a whole hour covering some of the basics of compost. And so I want you to have that information as we go along, or for your future reference. So this is what today's plan looks like. One of the ways that I'm kind of setting up today is to talk about the different tasks that you could do in your garden from now until the end of the year. And I'm framing that in a way to say that, there are certain tasks that need to be done now. Like you have probably 1 to 2 weeks to get these tasks done in your fall garden. The reason being weather, and the reason also being sometimes soil temperatures that are limiting it. So this would be something like planting garlic or seed saving or using season extension, which we'll talk about. There are other tasks that I kind of classify as soon. These would be things that in the next month, you could do these things. You could also do them in the next week. But in the next month, you're pretty comfortable to say, clean your garden tools, get a soil test done if you so choose. And then finally, there's a group called later. These are things that, by the end of the year, from now to the end of the year, you could be doing these things. You could start planting the 2021 garden, which seems weird to think about right now, especially as I look out and see I still have kale growing. You could also maybe think about building a raised bed. And these are just some examples of what we're going to talk about today. I've got a lot of other actions based on now, soon, and later. So you're going to see that today. It is that, if you called me or emailed me asking, could I plant garlic? I would probably still say you could probably get away with it still in the next 2 weeks. But I would be very concerned of your ability to plant it, say, at Thanksgiving or the start of December. The photo you see here is one of the now actions that I had to do 2 weeks ago. Knowing full well that I felt like we were going into a very cold period, I grew artichokes, globe artichokes this season. And typically they're an annual crop, and yet I'm going to try to see if I can make them a perennial crop this upcoming year. So what that meant was that I certainly saw the first hard freeze was coming in, and I came in and tried to create a barrier to allow them to overwinter using straw, leaves, as well as some additional protection with landscape fabric. You also see that I'm trying to experiment a bit. So one of my artichokes is actually under that pot, which you see in the foreground, with a mixture of straw and leaves. So I'm trying to see if one method may work better than the other, and hopefully have some success to share with you next year. Okay, so what you expect us to do is we're really going to talk about some of the now steps. We'll then talk about soon tasks, and then finally we'll talk about later tasks today. So right now is a really great time to think about starting a compost pile, especially because there's so much leaf material probably around your home area that you can really start to get this going. One of the main things that we typically recommend when it comes to addressing a soil problem, say you have compaction or something else, is to provide compost. And this would be a great time to take the leaf material that is coming from leaves around your property. You could also be taking then that green material from your garden and start to kind of create this composting system. In typical fashion, this is a two to one, meaning that you have 2 parts brown to 1 part green. And you might think of this, some folks will get very methodical and actually weigh the material and kind of go from there. But you could also just kind of think about the appearance and the layering of that. But this is what you're after, this 2-to-1 action of the composting system. One of the things to also mention is that there's 2 types of compost actions. There's the cold and passive, which is kind of the lazy compost, and there's the hot and active. Sometimes we get so focused on the hot and active, where we really want you to, make compost really quickly, that in fact, a cold passive system can work really well. And this is what you see here in this photo. I'm doing cold and passive this year, where I have a lot of leaf debris, I have green material, and I'm just kind of layering it and hoping from there to have a good base to work with in the next growing season. I think you also have the potential to think of this very start as passive in the fall and winter, and then in the spring and summer you could certainly kick it up, and that would be that you might be doing more actions, providing more moisture, adding more ingredients to make it a very active compost, so that it potentially becomes that compost pretty quickly. A bit more ideas on this. If you are doing this route of making a compost pile, consider you want it to be pretty close to your garden. I think that's one benefit, especially knowing full well that this is a start to the compost and you're going to keep adding ingredients every single growing season. The other thing to mention though is you may need to provide some moisture to start. Certainly a lot of my brown material is very dry, and while the green material is a little bit wet, I still am finding that we've had a period of very dry conditions. And so I probably need to go out there and actually provide some moisture, even though this is a very kind of cold and passive system. Ideally, as you think about a compost pile, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. So the width, the height, as well as the length tends to be the best approach. And this can really allow you to turn it and to kind of keep it under control. You may find if it gets bigger that you may be having to add much more of each material than you were really expecting. A lot of the practices that you hear about when it comes to compost and making compost will depend highly on whether it's an active or passive. Passive, that kind of lazy approach, is not going to require as much effort on your part compared to an active situation. You may also find with active compost that you maybe don't have enough time to actively get this compost set up and moving by the end of the year. You may also consider too that when we think about that compost pile, you may need to provide some supplemental green material with kitchen scraps. That's one thing that you may see from both the active as well as the passive, is that you may need some beneficial ingredients. The other thing to keep in mind when we talk about compost is that while by compost's nature and definition of it reaching a certain temperature should be able to kill some of those weed seeds and diseased plant materials, it's not always perfect. And that's something to be very cautious with when it comes to compost, is that for us to actively kill some of those weed seeds and some of the diseased plant material to get from overwintering, you've got to be very active on that. What to add then? What are some main things you could do outside of the plant scraps that you have from your garden? A lot of vegetable and fruit scraps can really go in, and certainly we want to avoid anything kind of dairy-based, fats, meat, oils, anything like that is not going to be a good green material to go in the compost pile. You see here a photo of that you can get these kind of fencing-like material and build up your compost that way. One of the benefits of this one especially is it allows for very good aeration too, and you can mix it really well. You see a lot of times kind of the three composting system, which you see here on the left, where you have those that are empty, active, and holding. And it's a lot of kind of moving things around and turning them. There's a lot of kind of procedures that tend to go with them too. You also note that a lot of them are still that like 3x5 width, as well as a 3x5 foot height with it too. But sometimes this three system can work really well when it comes to creating a very active, good compost system. Of course, you also have those that you could purchase, which you see on the right here. Some of the issues that a lot of folks have shared with me is that it can be very, sometimes it gets too wet in there. Sometimes it doesn't get wet enough to actually do the composting system. So there can be some intricacies with it, although they've made a lot of newer models on the market that can work really well. And as you think about maybe an active composting system in the winter time period, you could probably be pretty good with this, I would think. If you were then going to go the active compost route where you're doing a lot of active ideas in order to kind of get your compost made, the moisture will just be very important. You would also then need to turn weekly or more. You also want to try to increase the temperature, and that typically is turning the compost, adding ingredients, sometimes even taking temperatures of what that compost pile is like. And then even through all of that, if you feel like you've got a compost that looks like what you see here on the left, then from there, it needs to go through a 3 to 4 week curing process before you would use it in the spring. And basically, you're just kind of letting it reach the right temperature and kind of sitting out for a while before then using. These are all steps that you would need to do with the active compost route. If you are doing the passive, just you've layered that, you're walking away from it, you're hoping for the best into the next year, you wouldn't need to do all of this action. But the active route you certainly have to do. And it does also mean kind of that cold passive compost is it could take 6 to 8 months to get hopefully something that you see here on the left. And it may not truly break down as well as it could compared to the active. We also always recommend applying compost about a month before planting. This just allows for the microbes to get a little more active and a little more happy for things. One of the things that you could also do now is season extension. And so this would be providing protection for the vegetables that you already have growing from maybe the spring into the fall. And it wouldn't necessarily be that you're trying to grow new vegetables right now, because most of them would not be able to make it due to soil temperatures and changes in the amount of sunlight that they're getting. But it is those vegetables right now that you could provide for protection for and potentially extend them a couple more weeks so you get some yields from them. It's also one that is using sunlight, so there's no electricity involved in this. It can increase the soil and the air temperature, which is really what you're after. But that protection isn't substantial. So we're not expecting this to be, say, greenhouse temperatures, but we might be able to get maybe 10 to 20 degree more protection via internally in the air, as well as potentially in the soil. You also see it's pretty it's very easy for an individual to do this. The gentleman you see here on the left, I'll talk a little bit more about what he has growing in, but this is something where the cost is pretty cheap and you're able to kind of utilize it right now. One of the other benefits here is that a lot of the season extension can really translate well into the springtime, and you could utilize it in the spring as well as the summer. So not just merely utilizing it in the fall. So I'll go through a couple of examples of season extension methods out there. One of which is cold frames, which you might be pretty familiar with. And you see what a cold frame looks like here, where it's kind of an angled box that basically goes on top of the growing area that you have. A lot of folks will actually use a cold frame to start their seeds or kind of get their seeds ready for, the plants ready rather for springtime planting. But it's also one that can provide some pretty good protection for already established plants. You typically are also kind of angling it and orienting it towards the south for those winter rays. And then it also needs to be sited kind of on ground level with it. But plants are grown in the soil, the flats, or even kind of pots within this cold frame system. There's a lot of ones available for purchase where you're just kind of plopping it on top. there are also a lot of kits and DIY ones available too. I think it's also crucial with a cold frame to always make it movable. So it isn't that you are securing it right to the soil because your gardening plans may change. It's very important to have this thing be able to kind of pick up and move around depending on where you're at. And yet again, that south facing orientation is really what you're after. And you may find in your growing area, it's not ideal for this. As mentioned, you can make your own, and so you can kind of see that there's a design here utilizing wood that folks have had some pretty good success with. One thing, of course, yet again, there's not much difference in temperature in that cold frame, maybe 5 to 10 degree air temperature difference compared to outside. So in the next couple of months, that could be very great. That could really work well for some of your cool season crops. And certainly as you think about springtime, that might work really well too. But really, we don't see this having the ability to get you into January and February where the temperatures are still really cold out there. You also always want to think about some kind of vent here. So propping up that top so that you can allow for some vent and some aeration to get in here too. You can also make these with modified window panes and straw bales. I've seen a lot of folks do that as well. I think the only challenge there is that you still may not get as much kind of protection from the winter. On the opposite end is low tunnels. And the low tunnels are what you see here in this photo. So it's movable. You're just kind of doing a low cost way of covering your crops. Folks will use PVC pipes. They may even use metal pipes and kind of bend them over to create that hoop. There's also a lot of kind of wire bent ones out there that can create that protection. And then you're combining it with either a clear plastic or a heavy row cover. A row cover is what you see here in the photo, these white fabric materials. You can imagine though that they still allow for aeration and light penetration as well as water. And because of that, they don't tend to provide as much protection. Probably about 8 to 10 degree air protection is really what you see. You can also imagine that if you were to get heavy snow or anything like that, it's going to kind of plop down. It's not going to be taken away necessarily. It's going to really affect your crops. So a lot of times folks will use more of a plastic or a poly type of material for this. And you kind of see the comparisons here. The row cover, of course, can provide some protection, but it's still allowing for anything externally can still get into some degree. So really only about 8 to 10 degree difference here. When you compare that then to say a greenhouse poly, this is a special type of plastic that can of course be used to cover the hoops that you have in place and really provide sometimes some substantial protection compared to what's outside. Sometimes we see about 20 to 30 degree difference, which, depending on what the air temperatures are like that day, that can be pretty substantial and provide some pretty good protection for the crops that you're growing. In both of these situations, you're talking about investing in PVC pipe and plastic covering or row cover that's fairly cost effective. And it's something where they're not going to stay just there because your needs may change in this upcoming year or next year's growing season. So as mentioned, yes, we see about 20 to 30 degree difference from outside. That's what you kind of factor in. If you were to put this on a raised bed, so knowing full well that soil can sometimes be a little bit warmer in a raised bed, you may have an even greater protection with this too. The other thing though is you have to factor in just limited hours of sunlight and that soil temperature. So as we start to kind of decline in the amount of sunlight, a lot of our crops may start to slow down. So even though they're getting air, they're getting protection and the air temperatures in here can be okay for them to survive, they still may not be getting the sunlight that they need. So we just have to expect slow growth into the colder months. And still yet again, having this system set up, having this equipment, you have the ability to utilize it in spring and summer. So I know a lot of people that will start some of their very, very warm season crops in these low tunnels. And then as soon as it gets too hot in there for them, they'll remove all of the pieces. They'll take off the poly, they'll remove the PVC. And the PVC hoops are just being bent over to create that hoop. So you're kind of pushing it in one end of the soil and then kind of bending it over. But both of these, all of these ideas of season extension should happen in the next 2 weeks. So you kind of have to do your research and figure out what you need. Here's one of our educators, Chris Enroth, and I'll share one of his resources in today's email I'll send this afternoon. And you can see what he's using. He's got his poly, or rather his row covers in the top that you see here, floating row covers. And then he also has a poly he's using at the bottom. And they design a lot of these little special kind of grips that will actually kind of clip on and allow for the poly to connect much better with those hoops that you have in place. You'll find a lot of great resources on season extension because I think a lot of folks are really, they like the idea that they can go a couple more weeks, and especially in our climate, our planting zone, a couple more weeks can be pretty enjoyable for what we're growing. One of the things that you're probably getting a lot of right now is mulch, or rather the leaf mulch. And I would still suggest that you try to put this out in the next 2 weeks. This is just something where, if you've already taken out a lot of your plant material with your vegetable plants, coming in, putting down some leaf mulch can be really nice with this. And when I use the term mulch here, I am just kind of saying, kind of laying it on top of that soil surface. However, a lot of times, as a lot of us are aware of, those leaves can get pretty wet and they can become pretty matted. And so you may find greater success chopping them up before actually putting it on top of the soil surface. And in fact, if they have some kind of chopping where you've cut them up, then they would break down much quicker into that soil too and get some really good benefits. You also want to consider, of course, letting them dry out and then kind of laying on the soil surface would be quite beneficial here. I would also suggest probably not turning them into the soil. And the reason for this is that I think you're going to have much greater benefits laying it beyond the soil surface, break down into the wintertime, and then turn it into the soil in the spring. I just think that there's much greater benefits there than turning it into the soil right now. You'll also find, of course, that some leaf material is better than others. And depending on the species of trees in your backyard or in the growing area that you have, you may find that there are some that just aren't going to be ideal for you compared to others. We still get a little bit cautious when it comes to using black walnut leaves in the garden. The reason being that they have a juggling compound, and this compound can be released into the soil. Now, it's important to recognize that most of that compound is concentrated in the roots and the actual kind of bark of the black walnut tree. There still is some compound in the black walnut leaves, but it can dissipate in about 2 to 4 weeks. So you could take the black walnut leaves, lay them out in an area for about 4 weeks, and then you should probably be comfortable putting them into the garden because they now had a couple of weeks to kind of have that compound dissipate. One of the other things you could also do is combine it with compost and manure. So as you're kind of layering your growing area, you could certainly do that and kind of create your own compost, if you will, here too. The photo you see here is a couple of my raised beds, which I've already removed the material from. And the reason that you see kind of a mixture of straw and leaves is that I actually have garlic planted under there. So I'm going to try to see how garlic, for me, grows underneath a leaf mulch compared to a straw mulch. That's kind of what I'm going to experiment with. So I was thinking that I was not going to be able to talk about garlic today as I looked at the calendar a couple of weeks ago. And yet I think that you can still comfortably plant garlic in the next 2 weeks. I think you've got 2 weeks to get it in the ground. The reason for this is that garlic is just trying to grow maybe a little bit in the fall. Most of its growth is actually in the spring as the soil temperatures are warming up. So you're planting garlic in the fall, it's getting a little bit of growth, but it really is not getting a lot of growth. The reason for the 2 weeks is that I'm a little bit concerned that the ground is going to freeze by the end of November, or at least have a pretty significant freeze in that soil. So I think right now you've got 2 weeks. Typically we would say probably mid-October, yet based on kind of what I've seen the last week or two, and even into next week, I think you could certainly get away with this. We usually recommend a hardneck variety, and so it produces a garlic scape, which I'll show you a photo of. We also, the way you plant garlic is that basically one little garlic clove equals 1 garlic bulb. So when you have a whole bulb of garlic and you start removing those garlic cloves, you may find that you have 8 to 10 garlic cloves that are basically the seed that can be planted with it. There's also very much a direct correlation between garlic clove and bulb. So if you're planting a very tiny garlic clove, you should expect it to produce a very tiny garlic bulb next June. It's also important to realize here that when you plant garlic in the fall, those beds are not going to be able to be planted in probably until mid-July in Northern Illinois. So they're going to take up a big part of your garden area, and you need to recognize that those beds will not be able to be planted in until mid-July. Garlic just has a very long season for that. You see a photo here of my garlic I planted. I planted about 3 different varieties into these raised beds a couple weeks ago. And yet again, 4 to 6 inches of mulch. Straw mulch is typically what we recommend. You might be able to get away with a leaf mulch, which is what I'm trying to do. A couple other things, you're keeping the paper skin on of those garlic cloves. Spacing needs to be about 3 to 6 inches, and then 12 to 36 inches between rows. So looking at your spacing can be pretty good here, and you might aim for about 4, maybe 4 inches pretty comfortably down a row. But you need to have space between those rows. We usually recommend hardneck varieties, and there's a couple that you see here that have been recommended. One of the main challenges you're going to run into, which we deal with a lot in the extension office, is that it can be very hard to find garlic. You usually don't find it a lot at home in garden centers. What I would suggest you do is try to connect with maybe a farmer, a vegetable farmer in your area, an individual that maybe sells at a farmer's market, because those individuals will tend to have some garlic that you could purchase from them. And that is then what you could then use to grow in this growing season. If you grew garlic this past year, you could also save those garlic bulbs and grow them right into the soil this upcoming year. We don't recommend grocery store garlic. There's just a lot of unknowns about that variety, and it's usually a soft neck variety, which doesn't really perform well in our growing area. I've given you some harvest information, yet again factoring in that this is all going to happen around mid-July. But just for your own reference, this is the harvest practices that you would do when it comes to hardneck. So yes, I think you could plant garlic in the next 2 weeks if you can find the garlic bulbs and be able to get it in the soil pretty quickly. I think there's a lot of potential to do this. You see here on the left, the soft neck versus the hard neck. So most of the hard neck garlic is the one that you would get and utilize. So as you think of finding garlic bulbs, or if you have a lot of garlic bulbs already, consider that each of these cloves is going to then be planted 4 to 6 inches down a row, and then be planted, say, 12 to 36 inches between that row. So from the single clove, this porcelain that you see here on the right, I potentially have 6 garlic cloves that could be planted in the soil. You compare that to soft neck, the artichoke type, which you see here on the left, and while I have a lot more garlic seed to plant, a lot of cloves to plant, these are still really small. And so as I was actually going through some of my garlic bulbs, I had small cloves that I was not planting. The reason for that was because they were just too small, but I was able to utilize them in my cooking and actually go ahead and kind of get an idea of what that flavor is going to be. The garlic scape here is on the right, so this is something that always produces with garlic as it's growing. Typically this produces in June. I bring this up because you do want to remove this garlic scape, this kind of green snake that you see here, because it's really taking away a lot of energy from the garlic, and it can actually kind of negatively affect the size of the garlic bulb that you get. So yes, I noticed a couple people have just joined us right now. So yeah, garlic could be a great thing that you could certainly grow in the next 2 weeks. Something else you could do in the next 2 weeks, another now task that's something to consider, is a cover crop. Now, I want to be clear, you've only got probably 2 options, cereal, rye, or wheat would really be the only ones that you could plant. And it's important to realize that you don't have to do this, but I know a lot of homeowners and backyard growers are really liking the idea of planting a cover crop. And the cover crop is just something that you're growing at the end of the growing season that we hope is going to address a soil issue. It could provide nitrogen to your soil. It could help break up some of the clods in your soil, some of the compaction problems you have. But it could also do a lot of other great benefits and kind of keep it covered. You see a lot of, say, corn, soybean growers that would then harvest their crop and then put out a cover crop. And yet it is something that a homeowner can easily do. This is a photo you see here. This is cereal rye. And this was planted I think it was the first week of October is when I planted that after some pumpkins that I was growing. And I was coming through in this raised bed and I'm basically kind of planting it almost by hand. I'm kind of scattering the seeds out in an individual row. And I'm just going to get a little bit of growth. I'm just going to get some growth for this cereal rye. And then in the springtime is when I would manage it. I would need to cut it. I would need to probably till a little bit, just to till under some of the root system of the cereal rye to break down. But it's providing a lot of really good benefits to that soil. I will say that rabbits loved this cereal rye. It started coming up and I checked on it a week later and just saw that the rabbits were just enjoying such a great buffet of cereal rye cover crop, which you see here. There's more options in the spring and in the summer to plant cover crop, but if you were thinking right now that you have raised beds or a growing area that's just pretty dormant, you could probably plant cereal rye or wheat. Like with garlic, it can be a little bit hard to find cover crop seeds at this time. You might reach out to home and garden centers to see if they have any. You might be able to get some sent to you, shipped pretty quickly in the next day or two. You might also talk with some of the other fruit and vegetable farmers market growers in your area. They may have access to it. And then even if you know some corn, soybean growers, because you just need a little bit, you really don't need a lot to plant in your growing area, they may be able to provide you, gosh, almost half a cup, and you could get some benefits here. One of the other things that you probably have already done, but just want to bring up again is vegetable storage. You know, you've done such a good job growing these vegetables in the season, and there are so many of them that will need to be kind of properly stored for the upcoming year. And I've kind of given you kind of a list of kind of different ones that are out there. And a lot of them are based on the temperatures and humidity. You'll note too that some of them based on what the temperatures are in your basement or your area, that is going to dictate whether they really can hang out for about 2 to 3 more months since harvest. For instance, sweet potatoes are one that 55 to 60 degree temperatures is what you're after inside. And this might be a basement, this might be a garage. You see that a lot of them are within that 50 to 55 degree period, 50 to 55 degree temperature. Blue Hubbard squash and candy roaster. I have a photo of roaster I'll show you at the end today. Both of these are ones that will actually benefit with a very long storage. They can actually sweeten and get much better flavor to them. So I would certainly try to push those to almost 4 to 5 months for it. For your other ones though, you should have some pretty good success depending on what you have. Of course, factor this in as well if you've gone to any farmers markets and picked up these winter squashes, as they should also last this amount of time too. For some of the other ones out there, potatoes and onions, most of the time those are pretty comfortable in kind of a darker area, darker conditions, not necessarily too set on some of these air temperatures inside your house. You could also do seed saving. So this could be something that you do pretty quickly, you know, soon rather than later. And one of the things here is that, you know, recognize not all seeds can be saved. I think that sometimes is the issue, is that we kind of expect that, okay, I'm growing all these vegetables, maybe I could save every seed back and then utilize those seeds next year. And yet not all of them can be. They're not going to always grow true to type, which is the main issue we run into. You're really only looking for heirloom open pollinated seeds or non-hybrid. The photo you see here is one of my seeds that I started indoors last summer and I grew outside, sun gold cherry tomato, a beautiful cherry tomato. And yeah, it's a hybrid tomato. So I know that if I was going to save the seeds from that variety, it's just not going to grow true to type. It's not going to give me that typical sun gold flavor I expect. In most cases, you're also looking for very mature, kind of disease-free vegetables to do that. We still have a lot of tomatoes that we brought indoors as they have started to change color. And as I look through some of those tomatoes, some I know I could potentially save the seeds for, others I know I can't. That's really what it comes down to. So I did do a little bit of this a couple of days ago with the wet seeds of tomatoes. So this is one where, they kind of have that viscous kind of material around the seed coat. And this is one where you could potentially just do what we call fermentation for about 2 to 3 days. You're mixing it with water. You're kind of shaking it up every couple of days, a couple of times a day. And then ideally the viable seeds are going to float to the bottom. And those would be the seeds that you would put back. Almost all the seed saving guides are going to mention drying them, laying out on a towel to dry before storage is what you're after. So the wet seeds is one where it's very hard to separate from. So this is the best practice, is mixing it with water. And you see here in this photo, one of my orange tomatoes that I was doing this practice with. The top of it's just to allow for air to get in there too. On the opposite side then, dry seeds, beans, peppers, those are fairly straightforward. In fact, that's usually why you see so many of them in seed saving catalogs, is because it's very easy to save these seeds. If you're wanting to grow, say, the peppers and save the pepper seeds, you would want them to get kind of shriveled up on that plant. And so if you have them still growing on the plant, getting them pretty shriveled and dry is really what you're after here for the peppers. But you're wanting things to be pretty dry before you remove them. I kind of call squash a bit of a wet seed. You don't necessarily have to go through all of those steps as you would with tomatoes, but I think you have the ability to remove a lot of the pulp before drying, kind of on a paper towel. Where you're going to store them, dry, dark conditions. Put them in an envelope. We will sometimes recommend placing them into, some folks will say put them into a refrigerator. I'm a little bit cautious. I would be a little concerned about moisture in there. So I would actually put them into an envelope and put into a drawer. There's also germination tests to do before 2021 planting. And that's what you see here. You take some of the seeds, you roll them up into a wet paper towel, you put into a dark place, and then unroll that after a couple of days. And you should see kind of the germination, which you see here, where some seeds have germinated. And that can give you an idea of if these seeds are really viable and can be planted in the garden. So now we're moving over into a couple more categories. This is the soon. So this is that the next month, this is an action that you could do. For compost, raw manure, these are things that you would want to actually apply in the fall. If you got this from your neighbor, for a farmer, and it was raw, it was fresh manure, you would want to put that on the soil surface in the fall. We would never recommend that for spring because sometimes it's just too close of a window. If you had finished compost, if you purchased it from a place or you had it kind of hanging around, you could do either fall or spring planting. That's certainly kind of up to you at that point with the finished compost. If you were to add compost in the fall, I would still maybe try to do a little bit of planting just to kind of wake up some of the microbial communities, those good earthworms, insects, and others. You could also layer it with leaves in the fall. And then one of the things that I've kind of been playing around with is actually leave behind the roots. So most of the plant material that I have removed from my raised beds, I've tried to leave behind some of the roots because the roots will break down to the soil. And if I have compost and manure, that should also help that break down a little bit quicker too, those root systems. This would be a great time to also get a soil test. We typically recommend maybe every 3 to 5 years get a soil test. Yet again, you've probably got a month just before the soil starts to really get frozen is really what you're after. We typically find that price is about $15 to $20 per sample. It's going to give you a lot of information on soil pH, which is great. And it will also kind of give you a baseline to really work with. And you're going to maybe combine these results with what you know about your soil and how things have really performed. That's really what you're after here with this soil test with it. In most cases, one soil sample is about a quarter of an acre or about 10,000 square feet. And you may find that you have to get multiple soil tests based on where you're growing. As I shared with a lot of you all, I'm in a new house, and so I have raised beds that were established before I moved in. I have raised beds that I established this season. I also have an area that I was kind of curious about as I thought to plant some fruit trees. So because those are three kind of different growing areas, I actually ended up doing three different soil tests. Now, granted, I'm a bit of a soil enthusiast, so I don't think there wasn't any question I would do that. But certainly for a homeowner, you may find you have different areas that really cannot be combined to tell you truly what's going on with your soil. And like I share with you, every 3 to 5 years is what you're after here. This is also a good time to consider cleaning the garden tools. Yet again, maybe the next month you could do that. It's really important for anything that comes in contact with the plants as well as the soil. And the reason for this is we're trying to keep diseases, pathogens from overwintering on this material, these tools, before I then bring it back into the 2021 garden. That's my fear, is that there's going to be some pathogen kind of hanging out from this previous season and then move into next year's. You want to do a couple of things here. Certainly try to remove as much of the soil off with soapy water. And that's what you see here with one of my garden stakes, is I've got to really get the nooks and crannies and clean that out. And then from there, I would also recommend using a rubbing alcohol spray, even kind of wipes or even some bleach, and try to just kind of clean this up a little bit more. That hopefully that could help address and keep diseases from not being an issue next year. I would also recommend that kind of letting them dry outdoors before moving indoors, just kind of a final step. I recognize I'm asking a lot of you. I get a lot of like moans sometimes when I tell people, suggest folks do this in Master Gardener classes. And yeah, it's just a good practice to get in mind just because of the potential there. And I have to do it too. So don't think that I'm getting out of the woods here. We've talked a lot about vegetables, but I also know that folks also will have orchards in their backyard. And just want to mention here, this is a good time to start removing any leaves underneath your fruit trees. And typically, I would not recommend composting them. I would probably move them much further away. The reason being that a lot of these can move a disease into your orchard. That's kind of an issue, is that the disease can kind of be underneath on this decaying plant material. And then in the springtime, as it gets wet, it moves straight up into the tree. I'd also suggest, think about any protection from wildlife. I came out a couple weeks ago to look at my peach trees I planted this spring. There was already wildlife damage, even though I had protection in place. So if you've not done that yet, this is a great time to go ahead and do that. We also tend to not recommend mulching around your fruit trees. The reason being that a lot of the wildlife will kind of go under this wood mulch that a lot of folks utilize and chew on it and so forth. I mentioned here too, you might think about windbreaks for winter protection, sometimes putting in, say, straw bales or something else near fruit trees can kind of help keep the wind from really hitting them hard, especially as we look towards probably what's going to be a typical winter in Northern Illinois. And then, of course, you're not ready to prune just yet. This is mid-December to March 1st. So you could go ahead and prune end of the year, but you're not ready just yet. So our last section is later. So this is just some ideas that you got time on your hands. What else are you going to do? And you still want to grow something. A lot of this is pretty focused on indoors. I have moved some of mine indoors right now, and a lot of those cool season vegetables could work pretty well starting indoors from seed. You'll note that most of these are very simple ones: spinach, lettuce, herbs. They could all work really well. You could also consider kind of troubleshooting some of those other ones too. You might have some pretty good success with it. But ideally, you're having to factor in whatever temperatures are going on in your rooms. And I think that can be an issue. One of the things you'll know is that when we talk about seeds starting, we typically suggest 14 to 16 hours. And yet for growing these indoors, you actually want to consider more 12 hours. So 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness, because most of these types of vegetables really thrive in that 12 and 12 balance. So that's where I would go for a lot of them. Use a soilless growing media. So kind of whatever those container mixes are would work really well, but they have very low nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So you really need to ensure that they're getting the fertilizer that they need. You might also factor in room temperatures, maybe staying within that comfortable 65 to 70 degrees is really where they would be pretty okay and pretty tolerable of most conditions. Some of the main reasons that this doesn't always work out is because of the soil is drying out. That soilless media is drying out. So you want to make sure that you're keeping up to date with the water. The photo you see here is one of the flats of spinach I just started last week. And you see the grow lights, kind of those bendy type lights. This is an LED type of system, and so I can bend the lights in different ways, shape, and form. It also clips on the side of my desk that you see here on this table. So I have put house plants under one side of the grow light, and then I have a flat on the other side. We're moving more towards the LED lights that are available to you. Many of them are a little bit more expensive, and yet you can find some really interesting setups that may work really well for you. You could also get away with probably a south-facing window. That's also an opportunity here. This is what you see here in this photo, one of my bay windows where I have a rosemary plant that was grown outdoors, and now I've brought it in to try to overwinter it. Herbs are a little bit of a different group here, so they would be great with 6 to 8 hours of natural sunlight. So you wouldn't necessarily have to go through that 12 and 12 like I mentioned earlier. But keep in mind that kind of the type of herb that you're growing, because some of them can be very sensitive to the temperatures as well as the sunlight that they're receiving. You may also find that you may be overwatering some of them. This can be especially true for rosemary, where it really needs to dry out, the soil does, before you water it again. Microgreens are also something that you could do growing indoors. Kind of a 2 to 3 inches is what you're after. And we see a lot of folks that are getting into this just because it's not a lot of commitment and you're able to kind of grow them pretty quickly before moving on maybe to your next project. But it's one where you'll see that you're just getting a little bit of growth, about 2 to 3 inches, and the growing season, if you want to call it that, is about 7 to 21 days. I think a lot of folks really like growing microgreens is because there's just a bit of a flavor boost that they can get. So it is that, yes, they're no longer getting the fresh vegetables from the garden, but they're still getting something a little bit fresh, and by growing these, and can really enhance some of the cooking that you might be doing as well. These seeds of microgreens can be pretty expensive, just kind of know that, but very similar to another indoor setup that you might be doing with a seed starting kit or with the light source that you're after. So yes, growing indoors can work really well. You just got to think about your light. You have to consider what kind of vessel you're growing in, as well as what kind of media you're growing in, which typically container mixes work really well. And then you just want to make sure that you're providing a lot of good watering and fertilizers for this group. A project that I started 2 years ago during the winter was actually started doing a vermicompost bin. So basically composting with worms. And you see the vermicompost bin that I have here, where I've taken 2 5-gallon buckets and one is nesting in another. The one that's green has holes at the top for air, and then it has holes in the bottom, and it's nesting in that blue bucket to allow for drainage. And it's one where I've had pretty good success with it, where I'm just, I have about 1 pound of red wiggler worms I started out with, and then was just kind of feeding them a lot of food scraps, as well as other kind of plant material throughout that year. It's pretty similar, in fact, with your other composting system and thinking about what could be composting, what can't be composting. And then you also sometimes are kind of layering it in a similar way. Typically, you're purchasing worms from a company online. They're shipping them to you, which is fascinating. And then from there, you can kind of begin this pretty simple process is kind of what I found. One of the things to recognize is, when we talk about this, a lot of people are thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to smell, it's going to attract flies. And if it does both of those things, then something's wrong with your vermicompost. You've added a different ingredient. It could be too wet. It's not dry enough. There could be something going on. So mine has not smelled. I keep it in the basement, certainly not in my living room. And yet I've been pretty happy with its success with it too. You can find a lot of bins. So you can also kind of make your own too, which is what I tried to do. Know that it's a very long process, sometimes 6 to 8 months to get kind of a finished compost, if you will. And it, of course, is always done indoors. It's never going outside. The photo you see here on the left is finished group of the worm castings. And this is about 10 pounds of it. So I weighed it because I was just kind of curious. The separation process, removing of the worms from the compost, is a very, it's not the easiest process, as you can imagine. There's a great resource that I'll give you today through email that can provide a lot of great understanding of setting this up. But this would be a great winter project to kind of do and would have some great benefits. I utilize maybe about 2 tablespoons of that worm compost when I'm planting my tomato plants and others. I just kind of dig the hole, put about 2 tablespoons in of it. This is also a good time. You could do a raised bed. This is a raised bed that you see here that I built this past spring. Certainly could be something that you do this upcoming fall as well. It can be set up. You could fill it this fall for spring planting. You could utilize leaf mulch. You could kind of get everything that you need so that then you could be planting in it this upcoming spring. Ideally, you're about 6 inches depth is what you're after here. So most of the time, these kind of 2x4s that you see are going to provide enough with that. You could go a little bit higher, of course, but I felt that I grew a number of heirloom tomato plants and other vegetables in these beds and did not have any issue with them as far as the height of them. Ideally, you're after 3 to 4 feet. The length is about up to you. And then what's going in there is a mixture of topsoil, of compost, of other good things here too. A number of home and garden centers around you may also have a raised bed mixture as well. But yes, you could get this set up, perhaps, if you have everything you need. We get sometimes questions about the wood, and we typically do recommend untreated wood. Rot-resistant cedar is also an option, but there are some treated wood options available that can be fine to utilize as well. I think that's one of the things is as you're looking at the wood, go back and do a little bit more research to see if that wood is suitable or not for you. With this. The wood you see here is treated, and yet I forget exactly, I did some research on it before I actually planted or utilized it. You also note that this is bare ground that it's going on, and I came in and actually put some cardboard to kind of suppress the weeds. This is also a really good time, the next couple months, look at your seed packets. Most should be good for the next 2 to 3 years. And I would also say we fully expect the same demand that we saw last year is going to happen in 2021. This is also a great time to think about small fruit and fruit trees. We get a lot of questions about that right now. And it's still, I feel, a little bit too cold to successfully plant them into the soil right now. I would wait until the spring, and you'll also have much greater availability and just different types of varieties available to you as well. This may also be a good time to talk to others that you might be interacting with and ask what grew well and maybe what didn't grow well. I can tell you I had terrible success with green beans this season. They were planted in mid-May. They did not start producing beans until mid-August, much, much later than they should have been. So I'm back to the drawing board there, but a lot of other good successes this season too. So as we're getting wrapped up today, I see a lot of people are in the chat box. If you have additional questions, please go ahead and start putting them in there. But I hope what you've gotten out today is that there are certainly things you could do now and need to do now. There are some things that could be waited in the next month or two. And then there are some that's maybe later. Maybe by the end of the year, you try to do this. And most of these tasks are dictated by the weather. That's really what it comes down to. The other thing to also recognize is that not all tasks need to be done this fall. If you want to build a raised bed, yeah, you could do it this fall, but you could also do it next year. You want to get a soil test, you could do it this fall, but you could do it next spring as well too. But I always think this is a great time to really plan for those bigger garden projects in 2021. And I think it's great to be reflective. So really take some pride in how the 2020 season went and what you were some great successes with it, especially as we move kind of into this next phase of a season. So that's my email and that's my phone number, which you can reach me. We also have a good Facebook page, and we try to do a lot of insight in there and provide resources and videos. We also have a YouTube page, so you will find a YouTube link there. And if you go to that YouTube link and you follow our YouTube page, it will alert you to when we add new videos and webinars that are archived there. You get an alert via your email. The photo you see here is a couple of the winter squashes that I grew this summer, one of which, the one I'm touching, is actually a candy roaster. So that's that one I mentioned that's about 4 to 5 months of storage. In fact, let me start the video. In fact, I actually brought it in with me. Yeah, so this is candy roaster. So you can kind of see candy roaster is a pretty big squash. I'm yet to cook with it. I'm still gonna probably wait a month or two and then from there kind of cook with it. It is an heirloom variety, and they say it has really good potential for a pumpkin substitute. So that brings us to questions then as we get wrapped up today. I will create the questions. All right, so Victoria asked, is clover okay as a cover crop? So yes, Victoria, clover would be great as a cover crop. I think it may not be as successful kind of germinating right now compared to cereal rye or say wheat, but clover is a great cover crop because it provides nitrogen that it takes from the atmosphere and it puts into the soil. So there's a lot of great benefits with clover. The one caution though is that it does become a little bit invasive and kind of spreads out kind of everywhere. So you want to be a little mindful of that, kind of keep it a little bit more contained because it may spread. So yes, it would work great. I just don't know if we've got enough warm soil temperatures right now for it to fully germinate. All right, Linda asked, do your worms crawl into the bottom container? So they do occasionally, like they have that one container that has holes in the bottom and it's nesting in that bottom container. And they do it occasionally, but they don't do it as much as I would think. I think the reason is that I try to kind of keep that bottom pretty full as far as just their waste and their droppings. So that one that's nesting, I'm not removing finished compost. I'm kind of keeping that in there so that they're not going to move down. They're usually pretty good about kind of going upward, grabbing what they need and going down with it. So I haven't had too much. Victoria shared I used leftover paver bricks. Yep, that would be a great strategy to do. There was a question. I have heard that oak leaves are not good to add to a garden. Is that true? So with this question, sometimes we get concerned that the oak leaves are not going to break down in time for to plant next season. They can kind of become a little bit more matted compared to others. So if you are using oak leaves, that might be one that you actually want to kind of tear up, run over with, if you had access to say a lawnmower, kind of go ahead and shred them before putting on top of the soil line, because they just may not break down as quickly as some of the others. Sometimes oak also has, sometimes it just kind of messes with the soil occasionally, but it's nothing to be too cautious about. I would also think, if you had the ability and you had lots of different tree species nearby, there might be some great benefit kind of mixing up those different tree leaves together, just because they'll have different kind of compounds to them. So any additional questions? I mean, I've got right at 1 o'clock, but I want to make sure that we can answer any questions we have. This is one of my spray bottles that I have of rubbing alcohol. So when I'm going to clean my tomato steaks, once I've cleaned them from all the soil, I'm just going to kind of go through and utilize rubbing alcohol for it. One of the other things at my desk is you see I have row cover. So this is one that is not going to be good for season extension. You can see that it is 95% light is getting through here, 95% water is getting through here. It's maybe protecting the plant maybe 2 to 3 degree difference. So if it's 30 degrees outdoors, this is probably just 2 to 3 degrees that it's being protected by. This would be one more for the spring. You want something much heavier. All right, so you'll get an email from me later today with lots of resources because I know we're kind of in the, oh gosh, there's a lot of now tasks that you may have just realized, and I want you to have those resources. And any questions from there that you have, please just kind of let me know. You'll also get an email in a couple weeks when we've actually uploaded today's presentation. But certainly if anything's time sensitive, you got to figure out, feel free to reach out. Thank you all for joining today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and gosh, try to get outside. It looks really warm and sunny. So, all right, take care.